All right, good morning, everyone. Hope everyone had a pleasant and restful weekend. As I put in my bulletin for this week, it's amazing how much a difference a week makes. Last weekend it was 70, 75 degrees and windy and warm, and this weekend not quite the same. And last week, Monday, we were looking at another couple of weeks at least of hybrid, and this week we're in planning for distance learning. So welcome. Chad and I put together some slides this morning to kind of get everybody to where we want to start the conversations today. Not all that different in some respects from where we were on March 18th last spring. But we've done, as you know, a lot of different things in the time since then. And I think we're much more prepared for distance learning as we move forward right now. But there are still a bunch of things to talk about. So we'll go ahead and get started. Friday and before that we had our collaborative planning time. We asked you guys to focus on the big rocks coming out of the staff meetings. IMS, we had ours Friday morning. CMS, you had yours on Thursday afternoon. Today really is then shifting and making sure that we can finish these next 10 days, the last 10 days of trimester one, as strong as possible, and focusing on these next 10 instructional days. We're going to go right from this meeting into, hopefully, if Patrick's ready, into some training, and that training will be a little more clear once we get through a couple of parts of this presentation. Then today, after the meeting and the training, really focusing your conversations with your collaborative partners across the district on these next 10 days. What are the big pieces? What are the big rocks? We cannot do everything. So really coming out of today with that plan for the next 10 days. And then tomorrow, we'll shift gears a little bit planning purposes wise and look at our focus for trimester 2. And then on Wednesday, as you know, we've got distance learning beginning, and our focus really is trying to re-engage students in their learning. All right, so here we go. Focus again, next 10 days. And Chad, go ahead and chime in whenever you want. And then since I'm presenting, if you and Kim could keep a look at the chat, what we'll try to do is make sure we pause at a minimum every slide, go into conversation about the slide or questions and stuff like that. But what I would ask everybody also think about is taking some notes, just jotting the questions that you have down, whether they go into the chat or we talk about them as a large middle level group. They're probably questions that other people are having and questions that can at least be brought up when you're collaborating with your colleagues. And if we don't have the answers this morning, which in many cases we won't, maybe we can have the answers by the end of the day today or by the end of the day tomorrow. What distance learning looks like for CEI middle level on Wednesday will be much different than what distance learning looked like in the spring. But it won't be a finished product on Wednesday. There are definitely things that we can do once we get started to improve the product and the experience both for students and for staff. And we want to make sure we always do that. So with that in mind, looking at the next 10 days, and this is something that we have had the opportunity to collaborate every week, but looking at those priority standards, looking at our scope and sequence, and how does that change? Are the big rocks still the big rocks? And they probably are. Do we have enough time in the next 10 instructional days to put the focus on those big rocks to the degree that they need to be focused on? And also, as you're having those conversations, when we look at scope and sequence, are we at the same place, IMS and CMS? We need to end at the same spot because we need to prepare for trimester 2. And there are a couple of things that we did differently this trimester. We had at IMS, we've been in hybrid all trimester. CMS, you guys had 1 week, and it seems like a really long time ago, of full in-person. And if that moved us off of the sequence and being at the same time, we need to look at getting back to that. All right.
And I think, Randy, I don't think that we can hit home enough on we need to end at the same or very similar spot. As we look for trimester 2, specifically here at Cambridge Middle School, in the shifting to a new schedule for trimester 2, we have staff that will not be teaching the same content or even the same grade that they've taught for trimester 1. So those students will be moved or shift to a new classroom. So it's very important that we are as similar as we can be across buildings and across grade levels.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks. And again, and we'll go into a little more depth on these on some following slides. But also looking at our schedule, and we'll get into the schedule here in just another slide, but looking at what we can be doing with our grading and our intervention time. We'll talk a bit more about grading and where we've been as a middle level this first trimester. What can we control and what can't we control? And especially if we can identify some things that we can control and have a more positive experience or more successful outcome for more students, that's critical. Okay. Any questions before we move on? Okay, hearing none. All right, and this is a slide and some of you maybe have already seen it. This is something that was shared with families on Thursday as well, as we were starting to transition to distance learning. So I'll give you a moment to just take a look at this and reflect on it just for a few moments here, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it. Okay, so let's go ahead, and if you've got questions and stuff, absolutely either put them in the chat or wait till we pause in the conversation. But it's really trying to do and provide as flexible a schedule as we can for families, but also having some expectations of them that go much beyond what we had done in the spring. And that's where the synchronous expectations and the asynchronous opportunity comes into place. So what we're expecting is that teachers will present synchronous or live lessons through Google Meets according to this modified schedule. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but it's basically the same schedule that we've been doing every Friday since the start of the year. All right. And that synchronous piece has been an expectation for students, and we're going to expect students to attend and receive those synchronous lessons according to this schedule. One of the things that we're looking at doing is, and it comes down below, we expect the teachers to record that lesson. If you have one class or content that you teach all day, then that would be recording one lesson. If you have two different preps, then it basically would be recording both of those and posting those to your Google Classrooms. The whole 25 minutes doesn't need to be recorded. If you have a presentation that lasts 10 minutes and that's followed up by 15 minutes of conversation with students, maybe students working together remotely to answer some questions or whatever, the recording doesn't need to be the whole 25 minutes. It's really the amount of time that you are directly presenting the lesson to students. Having said that, if as you work through it and you see how your lessons are going, there might be some real benefit to recording some of the conversations or feedback students have for other students as they may look at it asynchronously. But the synchronous expectations from 8:30 till 12 o'clock, we would be in there live, and students have the opportunity and the expectation that they would be in live. However, we don't know what story every student, every family has. I know my son is in 6th grade at CMS, and to this point, he's been able to get in, and he'll do all of his lessons synchronously in the morning. However, because elementary is moving to distance learning as well, and they are not set up for distance learning with the technology that we had even in the spring, that's going to present some challenges, some huge challenges for some families. So we need to give them that asynchronous opportunity. Some families just can't do it in the morning, and we're not judging that. And that's why we need to make sure that we have those lessons recorded. And we really want to emphasize that we're not recording the Google Meets. We're actually just recording the Screencastify. And I'm trying to model that however well right now. So it's just a recording of the slides or what we're presenting and the conversation that's in there. We're not.
One of the questions, Randy, that came out from Curtis was a conversation that you and I had about recording. So for math, like doing recorded lessons each day and then using the scheduled time to meet with students to support them. And the conversation that Randy and I had in regards to that, absolutely an opportunity to be able to do that. I think we just have to be very cautious in regards to having students, be in classes from 8:30 to noon, and then a couple hours worth of recorded opportunities in the afternoon. So we just have to really be cautious as a grade level and as a team to what we're asking students to be able to do, knowing that they're going to be sharing their Chromebook with potentially multiple other family members,
right,
as well.
Yep. And we'll talk about that here in the next slide as well, what those expectations are for students and for staff. So any other questions regarding the synchronous versus the asynchronous? And what you have on here, and you can come back to it at some point if you ever feel that you have a hard time sleeping, this on the right side here, this distance learning plan, this little rectangle down there is just a link to what we've already shared with families, so that you can see what they've been getting. Any other questions regarding synchronous, asynchronous?
There was just a question in regards to why do we have to record using Screencastify versus just recording the Google Meets? And there was a response in there then about just student confidentiality. And I think it's important to note that when we're recording a Google Meets, we have faces, we have names, and we're also opening up, the recording into homes of all of those individuals that will be in Google Meets.
Yep.
And that's one of the things that Patrick will be addressing after this, just in regards to the recording and some of those other issues that we've could potentially run into. So
right, no, absolutely, and I think good comment, because even as I do a Screencastify, and as you know, as I'm presenting here, if I need to go out or something, Screencastify will record whatever window I have open. And if I have the window that has the Google Meets open, it'll record that for however long I have that showing. And it's not like we're not going to make mistakes or errors, or, because I did this last week. I think it was for the staff meeting we had on Friday morning. And there was a couple of times where I was clicking around, going to different things that we were showing, and the Google Meet showed up. And if that happens for your classroom, don't worry about it. Some of that will happen. We're going to do our best to keep and respect the confidentiality and privacy of our students and families. And if that means that, my lesson has 10 seconds where the Google Meets windows show up with student names and stuff, that's fine. We try not to have that happen, but those things are going to happen, and we're going to move on. So, all right, so let's go next to the next slide here. And this is probably where we should have quite a bit of conversation, and it kind of goes back to the question Curtis had as well. And even as Chad and I have been bouncing this around with Kim and Kyle and Trish the last week, it's changing. And what I would ask you guys to do is as we talk about it. Think about it, reflect on it. What does that mean for you as a grade level? What does that mean? But we have to make sure that we are setting our kids up for success. And so I'll just walk through this a little bit, and we can have some more conversations. Very different from last spring, where it was very flexible. Students came in when they wanted to or when they had time. And we all know, those of us that were here, how that was a challenge for many, many students. So this is taking some of the things we've had some success with and building on that. So the thought would be, again, taking that Friday modified schedule and carrying it forward to every day. The morning would be that modified schedule. So if students have their first period class would start at 8:30, their period 7 class would end at 12 o'clock. For students at IMS, that doesn't necessarily mean they have class all morning, because in 7th and 8th grade, if they have a study hall, they will no longer have a expectation to be in their study hall whatever period they have it. In 6th grade, for example, advisory period 7, I do not anticipate students needing to be in, depending on how 6th grade wants to handle it, where they're going to be in for that full 25, 30 minutes.
And that'll be the same for CMS. We won't be running our study halls or our Project Lead the Way extension courses.
Right. So it's 3.5 hours, probably closer to 3 hours for most students. And then you take 5 minutes off every hour. And that might seem like a lot of time for some people. It might seem like not enough for others. And what we'll find is that's probably the way families and students will look at it as well. It's going to be way too much for some, and it's not going to be even close to enough for others. We have to think about what our goal is. And what I put in here is, this is our instructional time. Using Marzano's language, if students meet that, if they're able to be in your classes synchronously in the morning, they're at level 3. That is success. If that's all they do, if that's all we can get students to do, that will be success in my book. It's not as much a time as having them here in front of us every day, but it's a lot better than what we have seen in the past, as far as when in the spring, when we had a much less structured time. It also gives them the afternoon where they're not sitting in front of a screen for 7 or 8 hours a day. It puts them in front of the screen for 3.5 hours, but also has a little bit of a break in there as well. That allows us as teachers to have planning time in the afternoon on Monday and Friday, which we'll get into in a little bit, but also for interventions Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Okay. Now, if you're kind of thinking that that's not enough time, I would put us back to, what are those big rocks? Because we cannot teach everything that we need to teach, or that we've always taught in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, science, social studies, whatever the class is, that we've taught in person for 50 minutes a day for a full year. And now we're looking at 25 minutes a day synchronously in a distance learning model. We can't. So we really, really, really need to focus on those big rocks. And never more so than now is it important for that collaboration across the district to make sure that we agree on what those big rocks are, and we agree on when we're teaching them and how we're teaching them. And this is this is probably the part where we can have some conversation and get some feedback from you guys. This was my thought process as we were building this. We have those 3 to 3.5 hours of synchronous instruction, probably closer to 3. If that's not enough, we can be selective about what else they do. At a maximum, I would start with this. Perhaps, and this is just a perhaps, there's an additional 20 minutes of math each day. Or maybe there's 20 minutes of math on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or whatever it is. But it's not everything, because we cannot add everything every day. And we can't necessarily say, well, Monday's going to be math, Tuesday's going to be English, Wednesday's, that's not going to be a win.
And I think one of the things too, Randy, in conversation over the last few days with just the schedule is consistency and predictability as we, as we flux from a distance learning model back to hybrid over the course of the next couple of months. I think it's important to just provide that same consistency for our students and our parents. And we know that 25 minutes in a classroom is probably not enough time. However, we do know the struggles that we had last spring through a full distance learning format, and we know the struggles that we're having even now in a hybrid learning model, just in terms of students logging in and the success or lack of success that we've seen with that. So knowing that we're trying to be focused and succinct, I think will help us bridge that gap as we move in and out of models.
Right. Well, and then the other thing that we really want to look at doing is Chad and I are both looking at creating a video, and it might be a shared video that goes to one video that goes to all middle school families. It might be unique to each building, but doing a screencast video, whatever have you, and talking about and sharing with families what the schedule is, what the expectations are. We've already communicated it a little bit in our parent news, but messages like this, we can't oversell to the families and what we're expecting of them. And so I think, and I think the other part of it is, as we're grappling with how much and looking at when we expect more, some of our students give more. But we also have a line where some of those kids right on the fence are going to fall off the fence if we expect too much from them. And I would use that as we talk about this math example, and it's really just an example. If we're saying we would add 20 minutes of math each day or 3 days a week, whatever it is, it's 20 minutes. It's not 20 minutes for the 50th percentile student, or it's not 20 minutes for the student that knows where they are and they just need a little bit of extra practice. It's 20 minutes for all. And it's time-based, not number of problems based. Okay? And the reason for that is if Randy Pauly's in your math classroom, as an example, and you give Randy 8 problems to do, Randy might take 2 hours to do those 8 problems if he's able to stay on focus and just because Randy's not great at math. If you give the same 8 problems to Chad might be done with them in 20 minutes. And so what we find then is Randy isn't going to do it. So it doesn't matter if you're giving him 8 or 10 or whatever problems, he's not going to be able to do that because it's that hard for him. The other thing I would recommend is having us think about how do we adjust what we're giving them and say, for example, if it's math, and I don't mean to focus on math as much, but if we're giving them 5 problems or 4 problems, how about giving them the answer? And all we expect them to do is give us how they solved it. They work to the answer because that way they also get feedback on whether they got the right answer. So I'll get off of that for a little bit here, but I would say that's a maximum. And then I think also from the English teacher's perspective, having the kids and putting in expectations on kids that they put in 30 minutes of independent reading a day, and we sell that to families and say, this is what we're expecting. I'm open to debates anytime with families about how much time their kids should be spending reading. So, so that's something I think we really should, we need to focus on. We really need to, as a middle level, agree to this is the expectation, because if we can't agree, no matter what we do, we're going to have parents and students that are going to be confused. And where there's confusion, there's going to be even more struggle. So let's pause there for a moment, see if we've got any comments in chat or statements or comments from anyone.
One other bullet point on that slide, Randy, while the questions are either coming in typed or asking here, is just CIO Online and the adjustment of our schedule to a 7-period day. Looks a little bit different for CIO Online. So Patrick, if you have any comments in regards to this, feel free to chime in, but At this time, what we're thinking is to restructure those meets, keeping them during the same periods that you would normally be servicing those students, and just adjusting it to the modified morning schedule. And if you need to connect with students further, use the afternoon time, just like you would with students that would be in person.
Yep. Yep. And that is something that we need to look at the schedule a little bit more now with the CIO, and see how the modified schedule adjusts when their meet times would be. And that would be probably a separate communication from Chad and I to those families, because some of them chose CIO online because they needed a flexibility. And having said that, some of them are frustrated because they don't have the opportunity to see their teachers when they want them. So they're really asking for two different things, and two things that are diametrically opposed. And that's why we're moving in this direction, not just for distance learning, but for CIO online, because it really should be able to give them what they want if they understand what it is they want. And what I would also say is, based on the results of where our students are right now at CIO online, there's a lot of room for improvement there. And any changes we make are probably needed changes because of the lack of success for many of our students.
Yeah, so Randy and Chad, you guys, so what you're saying is like they would also have that synchronous time with the CIO, but are you making that, sorry, I might have missed it, Brenda jumped in here quick, but would you make that required of all students, or no?
It's the required, we're not saying it's required, it's an expectation. And that's how I would put it in, and that's maybe a fine line between required. We're not going to require students, even the distance learning students, to be in the morning, because we can't. There's no way for us to do that, because we don't know what each individual student's home life is or whatever. But we are saying it's an expectation. And if they can't meet that expectation, that's fine. But then we expect them to go in and view the lesson online, and then do the assignment. And that would probably be something that we have been missing with the CIO kids anyways. And so I think that's probably a good direction to go, even if we weren't doing the DL. Okay. Any other questions, comments on this slide?
Randy, there were a couple questions. So I can address one of them in terms of the English for 30 minutes reading plus what we would be teaching, or just the reading. So no, we would continue on with our current, our current instruction, but obviously incorporating independent reading each day is a great thing to have students do. So what about what should we be grading at this time? And then there was also one just about how it would be nice for distance learning schedules to match up. So I think we addressed that one.
And we'll be getting into we'll talk about grading a little bit here in the next slide.
Yep.
Okay. Ready to move on?
Moving on up.
Let's move on. Okay. Oh, all right. Oh, let's see. Okay. All right. So as we move on, and this would be something really to be talking about today for the next 2 weeks, is looking at our weekly summaries and making it infinitely clear for students and parents what each day looks like as far as assignments. And my goal, my hope would be, or my expectation would be, that as we finish up conversations today, that across the district in those collaborative meetings, we would be able to create those weekly summaries and expectations through December 3rd, which is the end of the trimester. If you take a look at what you already had planned for these next 3 weeks, the negative is the kids are not in school. We don't get to see them in person every other day. The positive is we have the opportunity to see every student every day now, especially if they come in. We can't control that, but we can control what we provide them and what we give them for instruction. And kind of going along the lines of the grading conversation, and I don't want to overemphasize this, but I also don't want to underemphasize this. At both buildings, we've talked about where we were at the midterm, and it kind of changes every day. But right now, we have 1,141 Cambridge Isani School middle schoolers. At midterm, 663 of those 1,141 were failing at least one class, which is 58%. Okay, I don't want to look at things negatively or whatever. There's a lot of challenges with that. There's a lot of things that we cannot control, and they're all true. But I would ask us to think about what we can do, what we can control. And I know we talked about it at Built here, and we talked in staff meetings too. When we look at those and we look at the number of students that are just failing one class, it's like, okay, if we can look and see how do we get them back over the top in that one class. And I think one of the things that the real things that jump out at us as we're looking at it, and sometimes it's easier for principals or administrators or coaches to look at it because we're not in there every day with the students, is we take a look at some of our practices. And what I would ask you to do is look at your grade books over the next 3 weeks, especially as we're getting ready for trimester 2. Because there are things that we have in our grade book, there are practices that we have that contribute to the student scores beyond what the students are and are not doing. As an example, 12-week trimester, 6-week midterm, and some students, when they get to that 6-week midterm, they might have one summative assessment in their grade book. And we can go round and round, and we have a bit on what is the correct number of summative assessments, what's the correct number of formative assessments. And I can't give you the perfect answer because it changes and it depends on how you structured your class. But what I can say is that a student that's getting A's and B's in their quote unquote formative assessments for 5 or 6 weeks, and then fails one summative assessment, then has a failing grade on their report card for that class at the midterm, that's a problem. And I don't want to sit here and say that's everything that's going on, because we definitely have students that are totally not engaged and aren't doing anything. But we also have students that are doing what we've asked them to do day to day, week to week, and then the grades don't necessarily reflect that. And we really need to sit back and we reflect on what is the experience that my students have in this class, and is that experience showing through in their report card or in my grade book? And if it is, and that's the picture we want it to be, that's great. If that's not, or the picture's not what we want it to be, then we really, really need to look at that. And maybe it's the number and frequency of summative assessments. Maybe it's the, what should we grade? Guys, the grade is a reflection of what the student knows or doesn't know according to the benchmarks and to the standards. The grade should not be who's been working hard or a reflection of who's been working hard. The grade should not be a reflection of who has support at home so they get all their practice in. Those are some things that we can affect. And as we're looking at these next 10 days, or we're looking at this last kind of 3 weeks before the end of the trimester, we do have some afternoons where we can bring students in for interventions, and that would be a place to start. When we look at our grade book, who are the kids that need a little more with this unit? And I could give them a little more instruction on this unit, and then we could retest and go from there. So I'm going to pause there and ask for questions and comments.
Since there's a pause, Randy, I always like to interject. So just going back to the weekly summary, and I think it's important to note that when all of our families are in a distance learning K-12 format, they're really looking for a one-stop shop to be able to find what their child has to do for the week. And it's one of the things that came out of our survey from last spring. So I just can't reiterate enough that all subject areas from our specials, all the way up through math, science, social, please make sure that those weekly summaries are updated. As we post them to our web, we get several phone calls if there's subject areas that don't have the information in there. It confuses parents. So please make sure that those weekly summaries are updated and they accurately reflect what we want students to accomplish for that day and the week.
Other questions? Comments? All right, why don't we go ahead and move on? And again, you guys have seen this before, and this is where we're starting on Wednesday. It's maybe not where we're going to end whenever we end distance learning for this iteration, but this is where we're going to start. And even though we have some weeks where we have not full 5 full days, we'll stay with this. So Monday will be a staff collaboration planning time team meetings, and Fridays will be the same. Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday would be times where we would be asking kids to come in to interventions, and we'll talk a bit about those in just a little bit. But this is what has been shared with families, and unless the kids are coming in for interventions, their day is pretty much the morning if they're doing it synchronously. They can maybe do some extra math if that's where we go, or they can do their reading in the afternoon or in the evening or whatever it would look like. But this would be a typical distance learning week for Cambridge Isani middle level. Just as a point of reference, the high school schedule is fairly similar. They start, I think, at 9 o'clock and they go till about 12:30. So their periods are delayed maybe about a half hour, but it's also very similar, and which is good, except that if you have a family that you have 2 or 3 students, case or 6-12, and they're all supposed to be online at the same time, if they have the same devices, that's great. But as some of you know, the internet signal, the Wi-Fi strength and stuff is always iffy in certain areas of our community, and so that's also going to present some more challenges to families. So then we'll move on to the next slide, and these are where we can talk about some of the supports we will have in place, or we can start with having in place as well. And Chad already mentioned it, the CI Online, reflecting the new schedule. The grade level interventions, the virtual resource rooms, which we'll talk about a little bit, and then the selected students in person or in a hybrid model. And I'll start with that because that's something Chad and I have been talking about quite a bit. While our goal maybe was to start and have, for example, our SPED students or some of our SPED students and some of our EL students in right away, as a district, we're looking at where we are as far as community spread and saying, okay, we're taking 2 weeks. We're kind of resetting. We're not going to have students in the buildings for 2 weeks unless we're mandated to do so. And the mandated students that we need to have in are those tier 1 childcare students. And so that's why today, for example, here we probably have 3 students. I haven't seen them come in, but they're probably here. But we're mandated to provide that tier 1 childcare. And so we have a few kids in the middle level, and we have a whole bunch more kids in the elementaries this week and next week. But we're looking at that 2-week window really ends on the 30th. And so that's when we're looking to have in place some students coming in starting on the 30th and having them come in probably on their hybrid days So it's not distance learning for them fully. It's closer to their hybrid days that they're here. That doesn't mean that those students would be inside, in person, their regular ed classrooms. They would still access those remotely. But instead of having them access them remotely from home and hoping they get in, those students would be in the building, and we would use our staff, our IAs and stuff here to help ensure that they're remotely in the places where they need to be. And then we're also providing some in-person instruction based on their special ed needs. So that's kind of that selected student. More information will come out about that as we get closer. I wanted to spend a little bit of time. Well, the easy piece here is the virtual resource rooms. And I've got the example on the right side here. We're adjusting those from what we've been doing a little bit as we've been in hybrid, and really trying to focus. Each grade level will have their specific room, and each of those rooms will be staffed by several IAs so that we can have more than one student coming in at a time. And we've been able to communicate that, and I think that's something we've had a lot more success with so far this year than we did last spring, and I would hope that that would continue. The grade level interventions piece is probably the part that really needs to be fleshed out today and tomorrow. And I would ask you to think about that as you're talking with your colleagues across the district in your collaborative time, because that conversation is probably more important on who would we have come in for interventions. What data, what are you using to identify students that could come into interventions? And then I think the other big piece is, how do we do interventions? You know, and I just put in here, and it's an example, and you can click on it, and I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. Hopefully it'll take me to that screen. This is just an example. It's not how we're going to start, but it's how we could start if we have that conversation. And this is taking too long, so I'm just going to click on the one that was already open. And I'll increase the size here a little bit. And again, this is just an example, and I'll just use 7th grade or 8th grade. And bear with me as my computer's acting a little like my middle school son. All right.
So while you're bringing that up, Randy, there was a couple questions that came in. Tiffany had asked if we want to change CIO for these last 10 days or for next trimester. We would be looking at changing them for, well, the next 10 days for sure. And I'm assuming as we roll out our new trimester 2 schedule, and maybe we're that conversation for tomorrow, but I'm definitely looking to change it for this trimester.
Yep.
And then Ruth had added in there, if we're, as a district, putting pressure on the state to build internet infrastructure across the state. And I think there's a lot of pressures that go into that. I mean, we've made some strides into it, but I wouldn't say there's a specific coalition that's putting pressure on the state.
No, and I think that, like, the Minnesota Rural Ed Association, of which we are a part of, is one of those organizations that are doing that. And that would be an example of, you know, long term, hopefully things will get better. And we do have a piece to that, but it's not us as CMS or IMS or really solely as Cambridge Iceni Schools. It's part of a larger movement and pressure. And as that's going on in the background, parallel to that is what we're trying to do with what we have here. So, okay. Was there anything else there, Chad?
Nope, that looks like it.
Okay. All right. So what I have here, and this is just 2 examples, or 1 example in both buildings. And when we look at providing supports in the afternoon, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, probably the easiest way to do it would be to break down and say, maybe we can do 4 times here, say a half hour each. And then we, for example, this one's 12:30 to 1, 1:10 to 1:40, 1:45 to 2:15. And even as I look at it, you know, as goofing up some of the times. The point would be, if we have those times, then we can look at, in a perfect world, we'd have a half hour and we could put the students from each cohort into a different one and we could rotate them. But we don't have enough time to do that necessarily. Also, our cohorts, we may not have 5 or 6 kids in a cohort. So the example here would be for IMS 8th grade, 12:30 to 1 o'clock on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Students that are in pods 8-1 and 8-2 that need support would have an intervention time with Tiffany. All right. Those same groups of students then, if they need support in science, they would have support in science with John 110 to 140. And then if they needed support or some extra teaching in social studies, they'd have it from 145 to 215 with Josh. And they'd finish up their afternoon with Janice in math. Okay. Similarly, students in cohort 8-3 would start in math. And I think the thing to look at here is it's not necessarily going to be perfect, but if we can come up with an intervention rotation that would work, that's the first thing we need to do. Then we also need to look at how do we communicate that to students. And I would also say parents, and maybe that's a Google invite to those 5 students or whatever the number is. And maybe that invite also is shared with parents so they know that it's a subtle way for us to let parents know that their son or daughter is needing some extra support in math or English or social studies. And oh, by the way, they have an opportunity to get that support this afternoon from 110 to 140, as an example. Let's see, anything else with that? And we can play around with it a little more. This would end at 2:50. Maybe it's 30 minutes with 5 minutes in between. That would shave this a little bit, or maybe it's 10 minutes in between. Any of that's really, really up to staff to determine. And then I guess the other piece would be, as you know, some students that need extra help might need extra help in multiple classes. Well, and this is where it's hard to take what we have talked about with the 8:30 to 12 o'clock. That's success. If students are consistently doing that and we invite them into interventions and they don't come in, that's okay. But that doesn't mean we don't keep inviting them in for interventions and communicating that to parents and the students, so that if the student is struggling and the grade at the end of the trimester is not what they want to have or what the parents may be expected to have, we don't want surprises. If we've been communicating with them that this is where the student is, they do need some more support, and this is how we can provide it. If they make the intentional or sometimes unintentional decision that the student can't be there, that is what it is. We can't guarantee success, but we also don't not provide the opportunity simply because we don't think students are going to take advantage of it. So I'm going to pause there and get some reactions to this. And again, this is just an example of how it could be done. This document has, some 7th grade rotations. It really depends on the number of core classes that you want to do the interventions in and the number of pods, and if you want to double up some pods or not.
So a couple questions, Randy, that came in. So resource room and intervention schedules posted within Google Classroom. I'm pretty confident that we can put our resource room schedules out there. Intervention, like Randy said, this document here is an opportunity for us to start having the conversation. It's going to look differently by grade level and by classes, but we can work through the structured nature of it too. So.
Yep.
So feedback today as you're meeting with your teams in regards to how we're going to provide those interventions and supports. Just an opportunity here to start the conversation.
And that would, in addition to that, for this to be successful, guys, you need to weigh in and help develop what that looks like. And Chad and I are here, and Kim are here to help with that. I would really like to have the grade level plan for how you want to do interventions at some point tomorrow, so we can talk about that. And maybe that's a conversation in the building. Maybe that's a conversation across, 8th grade across IMS and CMS, and that's a conversation with Chad and I. I'm not sure, but this would also be something that when we're communicating to families, this is our expectation for the schedule. This is how we get support to students. This is where they can be in, and this is what we're expecting. But oh, by the way, this is also available. So parents, when you look at your son or daughter's gradebook and you have them tell you how they're doing in class, if they're not where you want them to be, this is where you can go, or you can steer them for more support. Getting the parents the information isn't going to solve all of our problems, but it will be a potential difference maker for some of these students, and that's what we're looking for. Other questions, comments?
Yeah, there's quite a few questions about the intervention time.
Okay.
One question is, does this have to be so scheduled? I'd like time to schedule with some of my students one-on-one, as many do not like to ask for help in front of large groups.
So I think it goes back to, again, just the conversation about starting point for the discussion. I know, and as Randy had alluded to, the intervention time, I mean, it has to have some structured nature to it, so we're not having students that have to choose what class they're going to be going to an intervention versus the other. So it's really about, how can we structure it as a system to be able to support students? And maybe it's a little bit more pressing of an issue right now as we're coming up at the end of trimester 1, in terms of the assessment work and other things that could be happening. So it's really a starting point for a conversation, as Randy alluded to, and how can we, modify and adapt and create a system and a structure that supports kids.
And I'd agree. And if we want to be flexible, we can be flexible. We have to have a structure to start from. And if we do have individual students that we want to invite in, that's great. Then if we have a structure, that student is in a cohort or in a pod that would have a scheduled time with me anyways. And if as an example, we have 30 minutes for each group, whether that's 2 pods or 1 pod, it doesn't really matter. Then I would communicate with those students in that pod that I wanted to meet with individually. Knowing that if I communicate and send out an invite to these 5 students, if all 5 show up, that's awesome. More than likely, not all 5 are going to show up. And so it might end up being more 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 anyways. But we have to have some structure. As staff, we need to have that structure so that we know who we can talk to and who we can work with, because it all starts from there. Because we also then we have to figure out what are we using for our what data are we using to bring them in, and what are we going to go over with them. If we just took a quiz and we say, those students that didn't do well on the quiz, I need you to be here tomorrow from 1:30 to 2 o'clock. We're going to reteach it for this 15 minutes, and then I'll give you another opportunity to show what you know, as an example. But we have to have some structure, because without it, we're going to have fewer and fewer students involved.
Is this intervention time to be by invitation only?
I guess my question would be is, so if I'm in cohort 8-4, and I guess I would say no. But then as teachers, how are we letting kids know when we have, for example, the advanced math group is maybe 7.3. How are we communicating to those students, that group, when their intervention schedule is? And, do we do that as a group and we do that right away? And then each day or each week, we invite kids to come in and we say, we have interventions with you. I need you to be in for your math intervention or math time on Tuesday from 2 to 3. I don't know how that is. I guess that would be those details are what we have to talk about. And the best answers or solutions are going to be developed by teachers. And also know that we also have the resource rooms. Those resource rooms are open to any student. Special ed, regular ed, EL, LMNOP, all students are available or are able to come into those and get support.
There's a comment that CIO needs to be separate, not grouped with a cohort in the school because the curriculum and pacing are different.
Yep. More than likely, that's absolutely the case. And that's why when I was just doing these, it's just a matter of making sure that we have them separate. The same could be said for the advanced math cohort. Now, the other challenge is that we may not be able to separate them as much. And so maybe the advanced math cohort, the only time they would really need to be separate, as an example, is during their math time.
A question, if we were to combine cohorts together, would it be okay to have open office hours for students to check in by their own choice?
It might be. Well, go ahead, Chad.
No, I was just going to say, I think the absolutely. I mean, we're definitely going to have office hours. We should be looking at those opportunities for students to be able to connect. And I think we're getting buried in that this schedule is set in stone. When it's not set in stone, it's an opportunity for us to take a look at some sort of structured nature, start the conversation, and then being able to proceed from there. But absolutely, I mean, we have to have open office hours for students to be able to connect and ask just general questions.
Yep,
and then added the more flexibility for times we give to kids, the more participation we will have. If we tell kids when they have to show up instead of give them options, they will not likely show up.
And that's all true. The thing that we have to make sure that we do, though, is we also have to be able to have teachers have a schedule that they can follow through too. And, and maybe that's where, we have less defined when they have to be in, but we have to communicate to students when teachers are available. And with that being said too, I would put this out there and maybe we just reflect on it. The students that need the most support are oftentimes the ones that are less willing or likely to ask for it or to come in on their own. And so if we put that expectation out there, we invite them in for specific times, I think we will have a lot more success than if we just say, just come in when you have time. Because these are middle school students, time management is not a strength. It's probably one of their biggest weaknesses. And I would make sure we keep that in mind too as we are looking to set up something for them. With that being said, it is 9 o'clock, which is a little longer than we had originally thought we would be doing this with. That is the last slide for this morning's meeting. We will use the same slide deck and for tomorrow morning's meeting. Please also know that it's possible Chad and I will maybe put something together early afternoon to get some type of a check-in with you guys and see where you are before the end of the day. But just be flexible there. And then I guess the other thing would be, Patrick, do you want to take over from here?
Yeah, I can. If that was the plan, I wasn't sure what you wanted, what your plan was.